In 1960, a 26-year-old secretary with literally no college degree walked into the thick, dense forests of East Africa to study chimpanzees.
Right. No formal scientific training at all.
None. No academic pedigree, no backing from some prestigious university, just, a notebook, a pair of binoculars, and just this immense amount of patience.
Yeah, which is kind of all she had.
Exactly. And within a matter of months, she witnessed something in that jungle that caused the greatest minds in anthropology to send a telegram containing a sentence that would, it basically altered the course of human history.
It really did.
That telegram read, and I'm quoting here, "Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as human."
Which is just a massive statement. I mean, that single observation completely shattered a centuries-old paradigm. Because for hundreds of years, scientists, philosophers, theologians, they all agreed on one fundamental truth, right?
That humans were special.
Right. That we existed in this brightly lit, exclusive category, completely separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. Like we were the masters, and they were just these biological machines.
And today, our mission is to unpack the hard, paradigm-shifting science that destroyed that exact barrier. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are exploring the monumental scientific contributions of Dr. Jane Goodall.
And, you likely know her as this global conservation icon.
Right, the woman with the chimpanzees.
Exactly. But our goal for you today is to strip away all that pop culture mythology. We're going to look strictly at the data she produced, the entirely unorthodox way she produced it, and how she fundamentally forced science to redefine the very concept of what it means to be, quote-unquote, human.
Because she didn't just casually observe animals in the wild.
No, not at all.
She engineered a complete rewiring of anthropological, biological, and behavioral science. The way we conduct field research today exists strictly because of the boundaries she broke down in the 1960s.
Oh, absolutely.
So to map out the scientific revolution, we have a massive stack of sources to pull from today. We're diving into biographical records from the Academy of Achievement, exploring historical archives from the Natural History Museum.
Which are fascinating, by the way.
They really are. We're also examining academic overviews of a fascinating scientific cohort known as the Trimates, and dissecting decades of hard, peer-reviewed data directly from the Jane Goodall Institute.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. And to help me weave all of this together, I'm joined by our resident expert, who is here to take these massive shifts in scientific thought and provide the crucial context of why they matter to us today.
I am genuinely thrilled to tackle this topic. The story of the discoveries themselves is incredible, obviously, but the story of the methodological warfare that had to happen to even get those discoveries recognized by the scientific establishment, that is equally fascinating.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we even step foot into the jungle to talk about what she found, we really need to establish the landscape of the scientific world in the late 1950s.
Yeah, that context is everything.
Because the origin story of this research is, well, it's entirely backward compared to how science usually operates. We are talking about a 23-year-old Jane Goodall in 1957. She took secretarial classes. She saves up money by working as a waitress in an English seaside town just to afford a boat ticket to Kenya to visit a friend.
Just a completely normal young woman.
Right. And while she's there, she somehow manages to secure a meeting with Dr. Louis Leakey, who is arguably the most famous paleoanthropologist on the planet at the time.
Oh, Louis Leakey was an absolute giant in his field. He and his wife, Mary Leakey, were out in the harsh conditions of the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, literally pulling incredible fossils out of the dirt.
The early hominids, right.
Exactly. They were unearthing early human ancestors like Homo habilis, Homo erectus, along with these ancient, crude stone tools. But Louis Leakey had this brilliant, highly unconventional theory that was kind of driving him crazy.
Okay, so what was he looking for that fossils couldn't tell him?
Behavior. Think about it. You can look at a fossilized femur and determine that an ancient hominid walked upright.
Sure.
And you can look at a skull and estimate the size of its brain. But a fossil cannot tell you how that hominid formed a society.
Right, it's just bone.
Exactly. Can't tell you how they communicated, how they established a hierarchy, or, how they shared food.
Mm.
So Leakey realized that if he wanted to understand the behavior of our early human ancestors, he needed to study the behavior of our closest living evolutionary relatives in their natural habitat.
The great apes.
The great apes.
But wait, wasn't anyone already studying apes back then? Why couldn't he just hire a zoologist from Oxford or Cambridge.
because he specifically did not want anyone from the established academic system.
Why not?
Well, the academic culture of animal behaviorism in the 1950s was totally dominated by a concept called reductionism. This was primarily championed by psychologists like B.F. Skinner. And the prevailing belief was that true, objective science could only happen in a sterile laboratory setting where you could control every single variable.
Let me make sure I'm picturing this correctly. When you say reductionism, you mean like putting a rat in a maze or a pigeon in a box, pulling a lever to get a food pellet.
That is the exact mechanism. You strip away the environment, you strip away the social dynamics, and you reduce the animal down to a simple biological machine responding to a stimulus.
Right. If you press a button, you get a pellet.
Exactly. And that was considered rigorous science, going out into a messy, uncontrolled jungle to just watch animals live their lives. The academic establishment considered that little more than glorified bird watching.
Wow.
Yeah, it was heavily frowned upon because, you couldn't control the weather or the food supply or the animals themselves.
It sounds incredibly arrogant, assuming that you can understand the entire psychological depth of a creature by locking it in an empty box.
Well, Leakey felt the exact same way. He was deeply inspired by a cultural anthropologist named Bronislaw Malinowski.
Oh, I've heard of him.
Yeah, Malinowski had pioneered a method called participant observation for studying human cultures. He basically believed you had to immerse yourself in a culture, learn the language, and live alongside the people to truly understand them.
Okay, so Leakey wanted to apply that to animals.
Right. Leakey wanted to apply that same participant observation method to chimpanzees. And to do that, he needed someone with what he called an uncluttered mind.
Uncluttered by the rigid B.F. Skinner mindset.
Precisely. If Leakey sent a university-trained behaviorist into the jungle, that scientist would look at a chimpanzee and actively try to ignore its personality to maintain this illusion of objectivity.
Right, they'd be looking for the lever in the pellet.
Exactly. But Leakey wanted an observer who could look at a group of apes and see a complex society unfolding. He wanted a blank slate.
It's like Leakey was casting a scientific startup.
Well, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, he bypassed the traditional academic gatekeepers completely to find people who actually had the empathy, the open-mindedness, and the raw physical stamina required to sit in a malaria-ridden jungle for thousands of hours without ever trying to control the environment.
That is a phenomenal analogy.
Yeah.
He was definitely looking for disruptors. And Goodall was just the first of 3 women that Leakey recruited for this massive comparative study of the great apes.
Right, the primates.
Yeah, he eventually dubbed this group the Primates, though the press often called them Leakey's Angels, which is, very of the era.
I see them in the sources here. So after Jane Goodall went to Tanzania to study chimpanzees, Leakey recruited Dian Fossey in 1967 to study mountain gorillas in the dense volcanic Virunga Mountains of Rwanda.
Yes.
And then in 1971, he recruited Birute Galdikas to study orangutans in the remote rainforests of Borneo.
Right. And Leakey was highly intentional about choosing women for these roles, which was wildly progressive for the time.
Mm.
He openly stated his belief that women naturally possessed a superior capacity for patience, empathy, and observational insight compared to the male scientists of that era.
Interesting.
Yeah, he felt that men, conditioned by the culture of the time, might be too eager to disrupt the animals, or assert dominance, or interfere with the environment to speed up their research.
Because they wanted quick results.
Exactly. But he needed observers who could quietly integrate into the background and let the apes dictate the pace. And collectively, these 3 women completely transformed the field of primatology.
But getting Goodall into the field in the first place was a bureaucratic nightmare. I mean, it's 1960. She is a young, single British woman.
Right.
The colonial authorities in Tanganyika, which we now know as Tanzania, flat out refused to let her travel alone to the Gombe Stream Game Reserve.
Yeah, they deemed it far too dangerous for a young European woman to be living in the wild by herself.
So she found a rather brilliant loophole. She brought her mother.
I love this part of the story.
It's so good. Her mother, then, actually agrees to travel to East Africa and live in a canvas tent in the middle of a jungle just to satisfy a chief warden's safety requirements. I mean, it's incredible support.
It really is.
So in July 1960, Jane finally arrives at Gombe. But the chimpanzees are utterly terrified of her. They have never seen a white European woman before.
No, of course not.
For months, they flee into the canopy the second they spot her, and she is desperately trying to gather data because her initial funding from an American philanthropist is only for 6 months.
The clock is ticking.
The clock is absolutely ticking, and this desperation leads to her first major methodological choice, which caused an absolute uproar in the established scientific community.
Right. She starts giving the chimpanzees names.
David Greybeard, Goliath, Flo, Fifi, Passion.
Yes.
Now, today, if I watch a nature documentary, the narrator always gives the animals names. It feels completely normal to us. So why did giving a chimpanzee a name cause such a visceral reaction from the scientific elite back then?
Well, when Goodall later went to Cambridge University in 1962 to pursue her PhD, which, remarkably, Leakey arranged for her to do without her ever having earned a bachelor's degree.
Which is wild in itself.
Totally wild. But when she got there, the academic establishment treated her methodology as absolute heresy. In ethology, numbering your subjects was a universal mandatory practice. You had subject 1, subject 2, subject 3.
What were they so afraid of?
A concept called anthropomorphism.
Okay.
This is the act of projecting human emotions, motivations, and characteristics onto a non-human entity.
Right, like saying a dog is feeling guilty when it's really just reacting to your tone of voice.
Exactly. The professors at Cambridge argue that the very act of giving an animal a name means you are already forming an emotional attachment. If you call a chimp David Greybeard, you are subconsciously treating him like a person.
And losing your objectivity.
Right. You are losing your scientific objectivity. So they demanded she use numbers to maintain clinical distance.
But she flatly refused.
She did.
She argued that understanding their complex social behavior required seeing them as distinct individuals with very specific personalities, not interchangeable, numbered specimens.
Yes.
But the sources point out that she did have to learn how to navigate the academic bureaucracy to get her work published. I mean, the anecdote about her Cambridge supervisor, Robert Hind, is one of the most fascinating pieces of this entire story.
Oh, Robert Hind was a highly respected ornithologist and a brilliant mentor to her. He actually traveled to Gombe, witnessed the incredible complexity of the chimpanzees for himself, and realized that Goodall was right.
He saw it firsthand.
He did. He saw that the traditional, sterile, reductionist language of the 1950s simply did not possess the vocabulary to adequately describe the rich social dynamics she was documenting.
But Hind also knew that the academic review boards in England would tear her research to shreds if she submitted it as written.
Absolutely.
So Goodall would write in her field notes that a young female chimp named Fifi was, jealous of her new baby brother. And Hindi tells her, Jane, you cannot say an animal is jealous. You cannot scientifically prove the internal emotional state of a chimpanzee without scanning its brain.
So Hindi taught her this brilliant linguistic workaround. He essentially taught her how to write defensively.
Okay.
When she wanted to describe Fifi's jealousy, he advised her to phrase it exactly like this. Fifi behaved in such a way that had she been a human child, we would say she was jealous.
It sounds like a legal disclaimer.
It essentially was.
Yeah.
But it was a crucial, necessary compromise. This linguistic trick allowed Goodall to accurately document the incredibly complex, nuanced emotional lives of these animals without having her entire body of work dismissed outright by a rigid scientific establishment.
Wow.
Yeah, she couldn't break the system overnight, so she forced the rigid language of science to bend around the undeniable reality of what she was seeing in the jungle.
And what she was seeing was about to shatter that clean binary barrier between humanity and the animal kingdom. So we have her unorthodox empathetic methodology established. She has her names. She is sitting out in the torrential rain day after day, letting the chimpanzees get used to her presence.
Burning their trust.
Right. And then we arrive at November 4th, 1960. This is the observation that broke the scientific world.
Yes. This involved David Greybeard, a large, adult male chimpanzee who was the very first individual to drop his fear of her and allow her to observe him up close.
The scene described in her notes is so vivid. She is quietly watching David Greybeard near a massive hardened dirt termite mound. Now, termites are an excellent source of protein, but they live deep inside these complex subterranean mounds. She watches David Greybeard take a thick piece of grass, poke it deep into a hole in the mound, wait a moment, and then carefully pull it out.
It's covered in termites.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's covered in biting termites, which he then pulls off the grass with his lips. He was essentially fishing for them. But that wasn't the breakthrough. She watched him take a twig that was too leafy to fit into the hole and actively strip the leaves off the sides to make it smooth enough to work.
And that tiny, seemingly insignificant detail, the stripping of the leaves, is the fulcrum on which the entire history of anthropology pivoted.
Why is that specific mechanical action so important? I mean, using a stick to get food is impressive, but why did the act of stripping the leaves cause such a seismic shift in how we view ourselves?
We have to look at the strict definitions that governed science at the time. Taking a stick and poking it into a hole is tool use.
Okay.
Many animals use tools. A sea otter will smash a clam on a rock resting on its chest. A crow will drop a nut onto a road to let a car run over it. That is utilizing the environment.
Right, taking advantage of what's there.
Exactly. But taking an object from your environment, conceptualizing a different form for it, and actively modifying it for a specific intended purpose, that is the definition of tool making.
And up until that very day, tool making belonged exclusively to us.
Exclusively. For centuries, tracing all the way back to philosophers like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Carlyle, Western science defined humanity by one singular distinguishing trait: man the toolmaker.
Wow.
Yeah, it was the ultimate trump card. It was the only tangible thing separating us from the beasts. The prevailing thought was that animals relied strictly on hardwired instinct and biology, whereas humans conquered the entire globe because our brains evolved the capacity to conceptualize and manufacture tools.
So when Jane Goodall hiked back to her camp and sent a telegram to Louis Leakey telling him she had just meticulously documented a wild chimpanzee modifying a twig to manufacture a tool, Leakey sent back what might be the most famous mic drop telegram in the history of science.
I love this quote so much.
He wrote back, "Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as human."
It was a philosophical earthquake. I mean, the implications were staggering.
Oh, I bet.
If chimpanzees have the cognitive ability to conceptualize and manufacture tools, then tool making is not a uniquely human trait. And biologically speaking, it strongly implies that the genetic capacity for tool making was likely present in the ancient common ancestor we share with chimpanzees millions of years before humans even existed as a distinct species.
And what's wild is that it wasn't just a one-off trick by one smart chimp named David Graybeard. Goodall and the generations of researchers who followed her at Gombe and other sites began documenting a massive, complex evolution of primate tool use.
Right, it didn't stop at termites.
No. They observed chimps chewing up specific leaves to create spongy masses, which they then use to soak up rainwater from deep hollows in trees that they can't reach with their lips.
Yeah.
They use heavy rocks as hammers and flat stones as anvils to pulverize hard-shelled fruits and crack open nuts. They use sturdy branches as levers to pry open underground bees' nests.
And what's fascinating here is that we eventually realized this behavior isn't some innate hardwired instinct embedded in their DNA. It is, by definition, the foundation of culture.
Okay, let me stop you there. Because when I hear the word culture, I think of human art, music, traditions. How does chewing on a leaf to make a sponge translate to culture?
In anthropological terms, culture is defined as behavior that is socially learned and transmitted across generations within a specific group, rather than being genetically inherited.
Okay.
Goodall and subsequent researchers proved that different chimpanzee communities spread across Africa have entirely distinct tool use behaviors. It's passed down socially, just like human customs or regional cuisines.
Really?
Yes. One group of chimpanzees in a specific forest might use moss to sponge water. A neighboring group living just a few miles away in an identical environment with the exact same moss available never learns that technique.
Because they never saw anyone do it.
Precisely. They learn through intense observation and imitation. Mothers actively teach their young.
Wow.
If a mother is cracking a nut with a stone hammer, her infant will sit beside her for hours, watching intently. The infant will pick up a rock and awkwardly bang it against the nut. The mother will gently adjust the infant's grip.
That's incredible.
It is. It takes a young chimpanzee years of trial and error, developing the precise motor skills and understanding of physics force, trajectory, the weight of the stone to master nut cracking.
The sources outline some incredible regional variations of this too. Like in Senegal, where the environment is much drier and harsher, researchers observed chimpanzees actually sharpening sticks with their teeth to create rudimentary spears.
Yes, the savanna chimps.
Right. They use these spears to thrust into hollow tree cavities to hunt small mammals called bush babies. But over in Guinea-Bissau, the chimps use their sticks to meticulously dip for honey.
Right.
It's innovation driven by environmental necessity. If fruit becomes scarce due to a drought, a particularly smart chimp invents a new way to extract calories from the environment and then teaches it to their offspring.
And this realization, this documented proof of cultural transmission, regional variation, and the capacity to observe, adapt, and teach, completely eroded that thick, supposedly impenetrable wall between human intellect and animal instinct.
We weren't so special anymore.
Exactly. We were no longer the only species passing down technological advancements to our children.
Discovering that chimpanzees manufactured tools proved they possessed a deeply complex analytical intelligence. But Goodall's next major discovery proved that they were biologically and behaviorally far closer to our early hunter-gatherer ancestors than anyone was comfortable admitting.
Right.
Because she busted another massive, long-held myth, the peaceful vegetarian chimpanzee.
Conventional zoological wisdom in the early 20th century dictated that chimpanzees were strictly herbivores. They were viewed as gentle frugivores, eating fruits, leaves, blossoms, and occasionally supplementing with insects like the termites we just discussed.
But then Jane is out in the forest, and she spots David Graybeard high up in a tree canopy holding something pink.
Yeah.
She looks through her binoculars, expecting to see a strange fruit. But it wasn't fruit. It was a carcass. It was a baby bush pig. And as she spent more years observing them, she realized they aren't just opportunistically scavenging dead animals they happen to find. They are actively, strategically hunting live prey.
Absolutely.
They hunt bush pigs, small antelopes, and they place an incredibly high prize on red colobus monkeys.
And the biological reality of this hunting behavior is chillingly pragmatic. When they manage to capture a juvenile colobus monkey, the sources note a very specific feeding pattern. They frequently consume the brain first.
Now, I have to push back on the word pragmatic here.
Okay, why?
You are talking about chimps living in a lush, equatorial jungle filled with abundant fruits and leaves, expending the immense amount of energy required to chase a highly agile monkey through the treetops. Doesn't sound pragmatic. It sounds like a massive waste of calories. Why would they risk it, and why go straight for the brain?
It's all about the biological scarcity of specific nutrients. The brain of a mammal is an incredibly dense source of fats, lipids, and complex fatty acids.
Okay.
In a forest environment, those specific nutritional building blocks are incredibly rare. Chimpanzees possess large, highly complex brains themselves, which require massive amounts of energy to maintain.
Well, that makes sense.
Right. Fruit provides excellent carbohydrates and quick energy, but it lacks dense fats. The energetic payout of consuming a fat-rich colobus brain heavily outweighs the calories burned during the hunt. It is a biological imperative.
Well, I want to clarify a statistic for anyone listening. Even with all this hunting, meat still makes up a tiny fraction of a chimpanzee's overall diet, historically estimated at less than 3%.
Very small, yes.
The significance here isn't the volume of meat they consume. It is the highly evolved social mechanism of how they acquire it. This isn't a lone predator ambushing a rabbit. This is coordinated, tactical, social hunting.
The mechanics of the hunt are astonishing.
The descriptions in her notes read like military tactics.
Yeah.
A group of male chimpanzees will spot a troop of colobus monkeys across a valley. The chimp's hair will literally bristle with anticipation.
Yeah, they get incredibly focused.
And they remain completely silent. They touch each other to communicate intent without making a sound. And then they fan out. They actively anticipate the escape routes the monkeys will take through the canopy. One chimp will act as the driver, climbing up the tree to panic the monkeys and force them down a specific branch. Other chimps act as blockers, cutting off alternative escape routes. And one chimp acts as the ambusher, hiding in the foliage right where the monkeys are being driven.
It requires an immense amount of spatial awareness, anticipation of another species' behavior, and silent cooperation.
And after the kill, there is a deeply complex social ritual of meat sharing. Even the alpha male, who could theoretically take the entire carcass for himself, will allow other members of the hunting party to beg for pieces. He shares the meat to solidify political alliances within the troop.
And this was the exact smoking gun that Louis Leakey had sent Goodall to find.
Oh, right.
Remember, Leakey wanted to know how our early hominid ancestors behaved before they invented complex stone tools. He had hypothesized that early humans must have engaged in cooperative hunting and food sharing as a way to build strong, cohesive social bonds.
And here she is proving it.
Exactly. Yeah. Goodall's data proved that chimpanzees do exactly that. It strongly suggests that this cooperative, tactical hunting behavior and using food as social currency predates humanity itself. It's an evolutionary trait we share.
But this incredible 98.6% shared DNA we have with them carries a really dark, tragic mirror.
It does.
Because their bodies, their immune systems, and their neurological structures are so similar to ours, they are highly susceptible to human diseases.
Which brings us to the devastating events of 1966 and the polio outbreak at the Gombe Stream Reserve.
Yeah, reading through this section of the archives was genuinely heartbreaking. Goodall was pregnant with her son at the time. She is out in the camp, and she notices an older, usually very belligerent male chimp she had named Mr. McGregor.
Oh, man.
He comes dragging himself into the camp area. Both of his legs are completely paralyzed.
Route.
He is using his arms to pull his dead weight through the dirt. Eventually, he manages to pull himself up into a tree, but he falls, dislocating his arm in the process. He is left completely immobile on the forest floor. Goodall and her research team had to make the agonizing decision to humanely euthanize him to end his suffering.
And they quickly realized they were dealing with a polio outbreak. They traced it back to human villagers and fishermen living just outside the boundaries of the reserve.
Whoa.
The human doctor in a nearby town hadn't reported the outbreak to the authorities or administered the human vaccines, so the chimpanzee population was left entirely unprotected and exposed.
And trying to intervene in a wild animal population is a logistical nightmare.
Oh, definitely.
They managed to secure the live oral polio vaccine from a laboratory in Nairobi, but you can't exactly line up 50 wild, incredibly strong chimpanzees and ask them to open their mouths and say, ah!
Okay.
So they devise a plan to put the vaccine drops into bananas.
Which sounds simple in theory, until you factor in the intense, rigid social hierarchy of chimpanzee society and the medical nature of the vaccine itself.
Right. I was reading the expert notes on the pharmacology of this. Because it was a live oral vaccine, the dosing schedule was incredibly strict.
Very strict.
If you give a dose to a chim and they accidentally ingest a second dose too soon before their immune system has processed the first one, the live virus in the vaccine can actually give them polio.
Exactly.
They needed an exact window of space between 3 separate doses.
Now combine that medical constraint with the behavior of wild alpha primates. If a low-ranking, submissive chimpanzee is holding a banana laced with a perfectly timed dose of vaccine, and a massive, high-ranking alpha male decides he wants that banana, the alpha will simply take it by force.
So Jane and her team are out there, terrified, trying to micromanage this chaotic feeding frenzy. They're desperately trying to ensure that the alpha males don't accidentally overdose themselves by stealing someone else's medicine, while also trying to guarantee the weaker chimps get their life-saving doses.
It was a devastating, traumatic time for the researchers. They lost many wonderful individuals. The population at Gombe was never huge to begin with, so the impact of the outbreak was massive.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the polio outbreak highlighted their profound physical vulnerability. It showed exactly how closely our biologies are linked.
Yes.
But as Goodall's long-term observations continued into the next decade, she began to uncover their intense social and emotional vulnerabilities as well.
And this is where we see a spectrum of behavior that ranges from the most profound, recognizable compassion to utterly terrifying, calculated violence.
Let's start with the compassion. Goodall focused heavily on the mechanics of primate motherhood.
The developmental timeline of a chimpanzee is remarkably similar to that of a human child. They are born completely helpless and are entirely reliant on their mothers for the first several years of life.
Okay.
A wild chimpanzee isn't even fully weaned off its mother's milk until it is about 5 years old. And even after they are weaned, they remain emotionally dependent. They travel with their mothers, sleep in nests near their mothers, and rely on them for social support for years afterward.
And just like with humans, Goodall's data revealed that parenting styles vary wildly, and the styles directly dictate the psychological success of the offspring.
She documented a direct, undeniable scientific correlation between maternal behavior and social success. She categorized mothers into roughly 2 groups.
Okay.
You had affectionate, tolerant, and highly supportive mothers like Flo, who became one of the most famous and beloved chimps at Gombe. These mothers raise offspring who are confident, relaxed, and assertive.
Right.
When Flo's children got into social trouble or skirmishes with other young chimps, Flo would charge in and risk getting attacked herself to back them up. Because her children always had that secure emotional base, her sons often attained high rank and reproductive success, and her daughters grew up to be successful, confident mothers themselves.
But on the other end of the spectrum, you had the nervous, tense, or easily distracted mothers.
Yeah, bad mothers.
Right. These mothers were perhaps less attentive, or they pushed their infants away too roughly during weaning. Goodall found that they raised offspring who struggled to make relaxed social bonds as adults.
It's sad, really.
It is. The males rarely achieved high rank in the hierarchy, and the females often struggled with their own infants. It is essentially early childhood developmental psychology, mirroring human attachment theory, but playing out in the canopy of the jungle.
And this intense capacity for familial bonding led to one of the most surprising and philosophically significant discoveries regarding altruism.
Oh, this part is amazing.
In evolutionary biology, true altruism acting to benefit another individual at a significant cost or risk to oneself was long debated. Many scientists argued it was a uniquely human moral trait.
Because in a strict Darwinian sense, risking your own life for someone else doesn't make sense if your goal is to pass on your own genes.
Exactly. But Jane saw it happen. She documented cases where mothers died from illness or leopard attacks, leaving behind young orphans.
And what happens to them?
Well, if the orphan was over the age of 3, meaning they didn't strictly need their mother's milk to survive physically, but they still desperately needed emotional support and physical protection, older siblings would step in and adopt them.
That's incredible.
They would let the orphans ride on their backs, share foraged food with them, and build nests to sleep with them at night.
But she documented an even more astounding case that went beyond sibling bonds. She observed a 12-year-old adolescent male who was completely unrelated to a 3-year-old orphan take on the role of adoptive parent.
It's just wild to think about.
I want to pause on this and really dig into the mechanics of what an adoption entails in the wild because it is so critical. The sources specify that for an adoption to be successful, the adoptive parent has to do far more than just share a piece of fruit.
Right.
They have to actively protect that infant from socially aroused, highly aggressive adult males. If the massive alpha males get into a dominance display, screaming, charging, tearing down branches to show their strength, they lose all their inhibitions.
Yeah, they become extremely dangerous.
If a baby chimp is in their way during a display, an alpha will literally pick the baby up and hurl it into the brush. So this 12-year-old male took on the massive, physically dangerous burden of constantly shielding an unrelated toddler from charging alpha males, effectively saving its life day after day.
It completely upends the simplistic, cartoonish view of survival of the fittest, where every animal is supposedly just a selfish biological machine trying to maximize its own genetic footprint.
Exactly.
What Goodall documented here is profound empathy and immense self-sacrifice.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because as much as Goodall found breathtaking empathy, the observations of the 1970s utterly shattered her initial, somewhat romanticized belief that chimps were, in her own words, like us, but nicer.
Yes, the Gombe-chimpanzee war. This was a dark, violent revelation that deeply shook Goodall personally and shocked the anthropological world.
From 1974 to 1978, Goodall and her researchers documented what can only be described as a brutal, protracted civil war.
Yeah, a full-blown war.
A once cohesive, unified community of chimpanzees that she had been studying for over a decade suddenly fractured. They split into 2 factions, the Kasakila group, which remained in the northern part of the territory, and the Kahama group, consisting of 6 adult males and a few females who moved to the southern area of the park.
Over a period of 4 agonizing years, the males of the larger Kasakila group began systematically patrolling the boundary of their territory. And I use the word patrolling very deliberately.
Right.
They would move through the forest in single file, completely silent, stepping on rocks to avoid crunching leaves. They were actively seeking out the rival group.
Wow.
When they found a lone male from the Kahama Splinter group foraging by himself, they would launch coordinated, brutal gang attacks. They would hold the victim down, tear at his flesh, twist his limbs, and leave him to die slowly of his injuries. Over 4 years, they annihilated every single male in the Kahama group and eventually annexed their territory.
It was organized, tactical, territorial warfare. But wait, I have to stop and ask a question on behalf of everyone listening.
Yeah, what is it?
Because when you look at the methodology of her research, there feels like a massive variable here. Goodall was using feeding stations, right?
Yes, she was.
She was handing out bananas in a central camp clearing to get the chimps to stay close so she could observe them continuously. Could artificially clustering a bunch of wild, highly competitive apes around a pile of highly desirable food have sparked this aggression? Did human interference essentially manufacture a war that wouldn't have happened naturally?
This raises a crucial, highly debated question in primatology, and it is a point of contention that the scientific community still argues over today. The sources provide a very clear look at both sides of this controversy.
Okay.
In 1991, a researcher named Margaret Power published a major, highly critical book on Goodall's methods. Power argued that the banana feeding stations completely altered the chimp's normal, evolved foraging patterns.
How so?
In the wild, chimps spread out over miles of forest to find food, minimizing conflict. By centralizing a high-value resource like bananas, Power argued it created unnatural, intense competition, spiked their stress levels, and essentially manufactured the conflict.
Oh, wow.
She suggested that Goodall's observations of warfare were tragic distortions of normal behavior caused by human interference.
That is a very heavy accusation to level against someone's life's work. How did Goodall and her defenders respond to the idea that she caused the war?
Well, Goodall was actually remarkably transparent and scientifically humble about the critique. She conceded that the feeding stations likely increased the intensity and the frequency of the aggression within the camp.
Sure, that makes sense.
Right. When you have high-ranking alpha males competing for a limited pile of bananas, tensions are obviously going to run high. However, she firmly maintained that the underlying nature of the conflict, the silent territorial patrolling at the borders miles away from the camp, the systematic hunting of rivals, the complex political alliances, was an innate biological reality, not a behavior invented by the presence of bananas.
And other field researchers backed her up on that, right? The sources mention primatologists who study other chimp populations.
Correct. Researchers like Craig Stanford pointed out a harsh logistical reality of fieldwork known as the observer's paradox.
What's that?
If you do not use some form of provisioning or habituation to keep the chimpanzees relatively observable, it is nearly impossible to witness rare, complex intergroup dynamics like territorial conflict. Wild chimpanzees move incredibly fast through thick jungle and range over huge territories. If you don't keep them close, you only see fleeting glimpses of their lives.
You can't observe them closely without changing their behavior slightly, but if you don't change their behavior, you can't observe them at all.
Exactly.
Now, it's worth noting that Goodall later admitted in interviews that knowing what we know now, she would not use feeding stations today, primarily because of the disease risk like the polio outbreak and the unnatural clustering.
Right.
But the debate over whether the evolutionary roots of human warfare can be traced back to chimpanzee territoriality remains one of the most vital, fiercely debated discussions in anthropology.
And unfortunately, the organized warfare wasn't the only dark discovery of the 1970s. There was also the horrifying mystery of infanticide.
This part of the deep dive is truly chilling because it defies logical explanation. In 1975, Goodall observed a high-ranking female named Passion and her adult daughter Pom engaging in something unimaginable.
Yeah.
They began actively hunting, killing, and eating the newborn babies of other females within their own community.
Within their own group, yes.
Over a span of 4 years, this mother-daughter duo killed at least 6 infants. And later on, years down the line, another high-ranking female, Fifi, and her daughter were documented doing the exact same thing.
And what is most striking here is the total lack of a clear evolutionary or ecological motive, and the immense scientific humility Goodall exhibits when discussing it.
How so?
When colleagues asked if there was something traumatic in their upbringing that caused this psychological aberration, or if it was driven by a severe scarcity of resources in the forest, Goodall flat out admits, "We do not understand it."
The behavior just doesn't make sense. They consume the infant like it's normal meat from a hunt, and the very next day, the killer might casually sit down in a clearing and peacefully groom the very mother whose baby she just murdered.
It's baffling.
There is no lingering animosity. And strangely, the murderous behavior abruptly stops when the aggressors have their own new babies to carry around. Not out of a newfound sense of maternal empathy, but simply because carrying an infant makes them too encumbered and physically slow to hunt as a coordinated team.
It serves as a stark, humbling reminder of how alien their minds can still be to us. We share 98.6% of our DNA. We share the capacity for tool-making, we share the strategic coordination of war, and we share the profound depths of maternal empathy.
But there are deeply buried psychological mechanisms at play in the chimpanzee mind that remain completely opaque to human understanding. It highlights exactly how much of the natural world is still entirely unknown to us.
Exactly.
So you have the scientist who has spent a quarter of a century uncovering this breathtaking, terrifying, beautiful mirror to humanity. She has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are self-aware, cultural, deeply feeling beings.
Right.
And then comes the major pivot in her life. How does a scientist, someone who has dedicated her entire existence to meticulously observing these animals, react when she realizes that the subjects of her life's work are facing total biological annihilation.
This transition marks the final and perhaps most impactful evolution of Jane Goodall's career, the shift from pure objective scientist to relentless global activist.
In 1986, Goodall travels to Chicago to attend a major scientific summit called the Understanding Chimpanzees Conference.
A huge moment for her.
She is going there to summarize 25 years of groundbreaking field data. She has just published her massive, definitive 700-page academic tome, The Chimpanzees of Gombe. She is universally recognized as the authority on the species. She is at the absolute peak of her scientific career.
But the data being presented by other field researchers from across Africa at that conference was nothing short of apocalyptic.
Oh, no.
When Goodall first stepped onto the shores of Lake Tanganyika in 1960, the estimated global chimpanzee population was robust, somewhere between 1 and 2 million individuals.
Okay.
By the time of the 1986 Chicago conference, researchers revealed that the population had plummeted to a maximum of 300,000, and those remaining survivors were dangerously fragmented across 21 different African nations, isolated in shrinking pockets of forest.
Goodall described having this moment of profound, paralyzing clarity. She realized that sitting in the idyllic forest of Gombe, meticulously taking notes on the complex mind of the chimpanzee, was an absolute, indefensible luxury if the entire species was quietly going extinct while she was looking through her binoculars.
Right. What's the point of the science if there's no subject left?
She famously said she went into that Chicago conference as a scientist, and she left it as an activist. She knew she had to leave the forest to save it.
And what made her activism so effective is that she brought a scientist's analytical, systems-level thinking to the massive problem of conservation.
How did she do that?
She realized very quickly that the traditional Western model of conservation, which usually involved building a literal or metaphorical fence around a pristine forest, deploying armed guards, and keeping the local human population out, was completely destined to fail.
She tells a story about taking a flight in a small single-engine plane over the Gombe region in the early 1990s. When she first arrived in 1960, Gombe was just one part of a vast, seemingly endless equatorial forest belt.
Yeah, totally unbroken.
But from the window of that plane 30 years later, she looked down and saw a horrifying reality. The tiny 30-square-mile Gombe National Park was now just a green island of trees completely surrounded by bare, heavily deforested farmland.
Just stripped bare.
The local human populations outside the park were exploding, and the people were desperately, grindingly poor. They were cutting down the very last trees right up to the park boundary just to survive, to grow basic subsistence crops on rapidly exhausting soil.
This brutal realization led directly to the creation of the TACARE project in 1994.
What does that stand for?
TACARE stands for Lake Tanganyika, Catchment Reforestation and Education. It represented a revolutionary approach to environmentalism at the time, something we now call community-centered conservation.
Goodall recognized a fundamental truth. You cannot save the chimpanzees or the forest they live in without directly addressing the extreme poverty of the human beings living right next to them. If people are starving, if their children are sick, they are going to cut down the forest to survive. You can't blame them for that. So instead of sending in a bunch of Western scientists to dictate to the locals how to manage their land, she sent in a team made entirely of local Tanzanians.
A brilliant move.
They walked into the surrounding villages, sat down with the elders and the leaders, and simply asked, "What do you need?"
And crucially, the villagers did not ask for conservation programs. They asked for fundamental human necessities. They asked for schools for their children, basic healthcare clinics, and access to clean drinking water.
Right.
So TACARE provided exactly that. They partnered with local governments to provide family planning resources, HIV/AIDS education, and microcredit loans. They established scholarships specifically to keep young girls in school, which is one of the most effective ways to stabilize population growth.
Oh, wow. I wouldn't have even connected those dots.
Right. And they brought in agricultural experts to teach farming methods that restored soil fertility using natural methods, eliminating the need for expensive, damaging chemical pesticides that were running off into the lake. By drastically improving the standard of living for the human population, they relieved the desperate daily pressure on the forest. It is a brilliant, holistic approach to ecology that recognizes humans as part of the ecosystem, not separate from it.
And as she stepped onto the global stage with these conservation efforts, she also turned her sights on a deeply entrenched, highly controversial scientific practice: medical testing on chimpanzees.
Yeah, this was a massive fight.
Because chimpanzees are so biologically and genetically similar to us, the medical establishment prized them as the ultimate biological models for studying human diseases, developing vaccines, and testing pharmaceuticals.
But Goodall argued that the very similarity that made them valuable to researchers also made testing on them profoundly unethical. And more importantly, she argued that the conditions they were kept in made the resulting science fundamentally flawed.
The sources include an anecdote regarding her fight against lab testing that is incredibly difficult to hear, but it perfectly encapsulates her entire argument.
The Bob Gallo story.
Right. She was relentlessly lobbying against the use of chimps in medical research, and she managed to convince a very prominent virologist, Dr. Bob Gallo, to accompany her to visit one of these highly restricted medical testing labs near Washington, D.C., because, as she pointed out, the high-level scientists who are ordering the blood samples and analyzing the data rarely ever set foot in the holding facilities to see the conditions the animals actually live in.
Gallo walks down this sterile, fluorescent-lit, dark corridor. He hears the frantic barking of dogs used in other tests, and then he sees the chimpanzees.
And it's just awful.
They are locked in tiny, barren steel cages, roughly the size of a microwave oven or a small washing machine. There's no natural light, no bedding, just a metal grate for a floor and a vent for air. And these highly intelligent, intensely social animals are sitting alone in the dark, rocking back and forth with vacant, dead eyes, exhibiting severe psychological derangement brought on by years of total isolation.
But here is the moment that completely breaks your heart, the soap bubble moment. Gallo is standing there, taking in this horror, and he sees a young lab worker in a white coat walking down the aisle, blowing children's soap bubbles into these tiny steel cages.
Yeah.
Gallo turns to the lab director and asks, "What on earth is going on?" The director sighs and says, "Oh, we got a new director from the government bureaucracy because Jane Goodall has been complaining to Congress. We are now required to enrich the lives of the chimpanzees."
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals a staggering, almost willful ignorance on the part of the medical establishment at that time. You have an animal that we know possesses profound emotional depth, an animal that thrives on complex social hierarchies, family bonds, and open space.
Right.
This animal has been driven literally insane by years of solitary confinement in a metal box. And the bureaucratic solution to decades of psychological torture is to have an intern blow a soap bubble at them.
As Goodall eloquently pointed out, a healthy chimpanzee living in a sanctuary might find a soap bubble fascinating and fun to pop. But to a mentally destroyed prisoner whose mind has completely fractured, a soap bubble means absolutely nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
But she didn't just argue from a place of moral outrage. She used her deep knowledge of their biology to dismantle the practice scientifically. She told the top researchers, "You are spending millions of dollars trying to study the human immune system or test HIV vaccines using these animals as your baseline, but you are keeping them in conditions of such immense psychological stress and trauma that their immune systems are completely compromised by cortisol and anxiety. The baseline data you are extracting from a traumatized animal is scientifically garbage."
Her relentless advocacy was a masterclass in combining undeniable moral clarity with hard, irrefutable scientific logic. It was a brutal uphill battle that took decades, but her continuous pressure was instrumental in changing the laws.
And it worked.
It did. It ultimately helped lead the U.S. National Institutes of Health to officially end all federal funding for medical research on chimpanzees in 2015, resulting in the retirement of the remaining lab subjects to open-air sanctuaries.
So, what does this all mean? Let's take a breath and recap this incredible journey through the sources. We started with a 26-year-old woman with no degree, sitting in the torrential African rain, quietly taking notes on a notepad. She walked into a jungle with an uncluttered mind, ignoring the rigid rules of reductionist science. And by simply watching, she proved that humans are not the only beings that conceptualize and manufacture tools.
She changed everything.
She proved our closest evolutionary relatives, coordinate tactical hunts for meat, wage calculated, territorial war, and display profound, self-sacrificing empathy by adopting orphans. She single-handedly forced the rigid binary world of science to tear up the textbooks and redefine the very word human.
And for you listening, grappling with this information asks a fundamental question about how you view your own place in the world. Goodall's legacy forces us to realize that the line separating humanity from the rest of the natural world isn't a thick, impenetrable wall. As Goodall herself noted, after decades in the field, it's a very blurry line, and it's getting more blurry all the time. Recognizing the complex culture and intellect of chimpanzees forces us to accept that we are not sitting alone at the pinnacle of some biological pyramid looking down at mindless machines. We are woven deeply into a complex, feeling, thinking web of life.
Which brings me to a final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. I want you to think about how she managed to make these world-changing discoveries. She didn't use advanced technology. She didn't rely on a sterile lab or cold, objective detachment.
No, not at all.
She used immersive, radical empathy. She sat in the mud, endured the malaria, and tried to understand the world entirely from the perspective of the chimpanzee. If Goodall's deeply empathetic method of observation is what finally unlocked the hidden intelligence of chimpanzees, what other forms of intelligence in our world are we currently completely missing, simply because we refuse to observe them on their own terms?
This raises an important question about the future of scientific discovery itself.
Exactly. Whether we are trying to decode the vastly complex chemical communication networks of fungi spreading silently beneath the forest floor, or trying to grasp the rapidly emerging, entirely alien architectures of artificial intelligence, perhaps the key to understanding the unknown isn't rigid, objective detachment. Perhaps to truly see clearly, we need to throw away the assumption of human superiority, step out of the sterile lab, and observe the world with radical, patient empathy. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.